Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah, dear students. Welcome to OOP2. So I made this video today on 10th of April just to illustrate a bit more about JSON parsing, encoding, decoding in Dart and Flutter. Let me share my screen at first. So if we go just as you know, my preferred way always to go to the official documentation for Flutter just to get from them how to work on a specific topic that you would like. For example, JSON parsing. So JSON usually and serialization. It's mentioned here at the beginning, introduction, like it's very hard to find in these days an application without mobile application without communication with other applications or web servers to store maybe structured data and or to get another data. And usually this data could be JSON data. And this is just guide about this. Here it start mentioning there are two ways to work on JSON. And what I mean by JSON, dear students, here when you make an API request, for example, as you can see, you'll get what? If you make this one, an API request that we get from this, that I give you the APIs. Whenever we make request now, I just refresh now. Whenever I make request, I get a new JSON data. Of course, later you can get this JSON data, copy this output or the link, give it to any JSON formatter on the internet, paste, make it a process just to make it easier to read for myself. So this is just JSON data. Inside this JSON data, which is similar to Dart map, there is a slip. This slip is also a JSON object because it's using curly braces. If it's using square brackets, it's a map. So inside the slip, we have what? ID, which is this, and we have advice, which is that. So we have always let us say strings, and on the right side, maybe there's like integer, this is a string, and these are values, which is very similar to Dart map. And actually we call Dart map when we work it on a Flutter with this data. Okay, anyway, so let's go back. So it says there are two ways, either to work on manual serialization, you write the code by yourself, data modeling, a function for JSON, for example, converting to your JSON to object, then objects to JSON, and working with strings, or you can just use automated serialization. Serialization here means working with JSON, I mean. So whether it's encoding and decoding. So it says summary for small projects like our projects, manual serialization is very good. For bigger projects, medium project, no, automated serialization is better, which has some code generation. You give it the JSON that you will get from API to create for you data classes, maybe functions that you need in a better and faster way to not get errors while running your app. So for complex project, this one is better. For our project, simple project, this one is better. Manual serialization. You write the code by yourselves. And here it's mentioning what I said, you have to use, for example, later details like .convert, which is built-in library. It will help you to convert calling JSON decode or encode for your data, and it will give you this JSON decode that after you get a response from a server, this one will, for example, it will convert this string. Usually this is a string which can be converted to JSON decode function to convert it to a map of string and dynamic for you. So is okay. Let us go ignore this. It's not related to our project. This one, serializing JSON manually using .convert. This is what important for us. So usually, whenever you basic JSON serialization in Flutter is very simple. Flutter has this .convert, which has the encode and the decode function. Whenever I say encode, decode, always keep in your mind, here what they mention. Encoding, it means turning a data structure that you have, for example, data structure, for example, JSON to turning to string. This is what we call integer encoding. When we say decoding, it's turning a string to a data structure, for example, to a JSON. This is what we call, for example, decoding. Okay, just to make you understand this further. Serialization, it means for both usually encoding and decoding, we call them serialization. Okay. Just to make things clear for you. So whenever you work with JSON data, usually you will get like this JSON object. okay, which has, for example, two attributes. Each attribute has a value on the right side, and you can see they are strings, these values. Sometimes you are getting integers, sometimes other kind of data. And on the left side, we have what? We have the attributes, we call them. So it is actually same as JSON is same as a Dart map using curly braces, key with value, okay? So to work on serialization, you have two ways. This is the first way. You get the data string, you convert by JSON decode to what? It will convert to whatever you get like as a JSON string to map of string and dynamic. You store it in this variable user, and later you can access the user, for example, curly braces name, it will give you the name, for example, it will give you John Smith. And if you write a user, for example, this variable, inside this variable, we go to, we have to write a key name, for example, email, it will give you johnsmith.com. This first way, and of course, it has a lot of problem issues it mentioned here, which kind of troubles it will give you if you use this way. The better way is serializing JSON inside the model classes. So in the model classes here, you have to create a class, for example, for whatever you are getting. As you can see here, data we are getting, it seems for a user. That's why we should call maybe our class as a user. Then inside this class, usually we need to at least like for two functions, user.from JSON constructor, which we call maybe factory constructor in our scenario, for constructing a new user from the map structure that you will get. So it will take a data that you will get, you will convert by using JSON decode to a map structure, then you will give it, for example, to this from JSON. It will take this data, convert for you to a user object, or you can give later, maybe you decide you want to also to convert your user to a JSON. So you can create also a function called to JSON method, which will convert the user to a map. So you can maybe work on that map if you like. With this approach, the calling code have type safety, auto-completion, name, email fields. All these features will be applied when you use this way. So we create, for example, a file for data model, or you can write it in the main.dart, it's up to you. Class user begin, we have only two pieces of information we are getting here. So until if you are getting hundreds of pieces, you can create a data model only for the variables that you are going to receive, that you would like to receive. It's optional for you. So I just need to get here email and a name. So I'll create, for example, string name, string email. This is the constructor for creating objects. Then this is, for example, factory user.from JSON. It will take map of like JSON map of string and dynamic. It will store them whenever you give this JSON data that you get by using JSON decode function. So it will take this JSON data, take from them the name and email, store them inside the name and email for that object that we are going to create. And this function is also optional if you want to create it to JSON. It will just take your object, convert it to a JSON by taking out a name and email, put them in these fields, name and email inside the map. Okay, so map of name and email will be this one in map. This is the key, and the value will get the actual data. Whenever you write, for example, object that you created in this function, dot to JSON, it will take out a name and email, store them in these variables as a JSON, or you can call it as a dot map of string and dynamic. The responsibility of the decoding logic is now moved inside the model itself. With this new approach, you can decode the user easily. So before that, as I said, before you're working on that code, you can, for example, you'll get a JSON string from the internet. You use a JSON decode to convert this one to a JSON. A JSON decode will convert whatever you get, like a string that you get from the internet API. This one, it will convert this string to what? It will convert it to a map of string and dynamic. Why again map of string of dynamic? Because some values are, for example, here maybe integer, some values are string, maybe some of them double, some others. But always keep on your mind the left side, it is just a string. Okay, that's why we have say string of dynamic or and dynamic for the. So after we get these data, we create an object var user equal user dot from JSON. Our from JSON function, this one will take a JSON data and will give you, for example, a user object. So var user equal user dot from JSON, and you give, for example, this is like a JSON data that you get from, for example, from the internet user map. It will be converted to a user. Then now, after you get the user now, this user, as you know, has two parameters, has name and email. You can print, for example, user.name, or you can print also user.email to get the data of that object. To encode the user, you can pass also the user object to JSON encode function. You don't need to call to JSON, for example, if you want to just use ready function. We have just our object that we get the user, just we give it to the JSON encode. It will give you what? It will give you out of this JSON or map, that map will be converted to immediately a string if you don't like to write to JSON function. So, and this is like basically what like the JSON or serialization is like. If we go back to our, for example, in our Android study project, maybe I was using something else, some way different a little bit than this, but actually it is the same logic at the end. So inside this API request that we use, for example, advice application. If you take a look about this application, it is this application. Whenever you click on advise me, you'll get a new advice. And just image.network I use from here. And it's like just simple what application bar. So whenever you click, you can just get more advices. And only there's a button here with some elevation or shadow. Anyway, so if you go back now to the this JSON code, inside the JSON code now here, a row JSON code, we call this one, we have a slip object. If you go inside, if you write a slip, the slip has what? Inside the slip, we have an ID and advice. The ID will give you this number. If you write advice, you'll get that one. This is JSON parsing. You have to go through each level. This is the first level. After you get JSON code, you have to go where? To the next level. To get the data, you have to go to the slip. The slip will give you return for you a JSON object. This JSON object has only two, ID and advice. Sometimes they are using maybe instead of curly braces, what array, square brackets. So at that time you have to use, for example, inside the slip you have to go and use index. For example, index there, this index 0, maybe there is another index 1, and so on. If it is an array, but here there is no array for that. Okay, let us go back to the Dart code. So for building an advice application, so as we said, there are two pieces of information on the code that we are getting, only ID legal or with advice. So if we go now here inside the main.dart, we import the dart convert for encode and decode functions, material for widgets, and the HTTP for making a request to the internet. As you know, you have to put it, of course, in the pubspec.yaml. Then you have to click pub-get to download this HTTP. So you can make connection to the API and get the data by using a get function. So inside I started creating inside the main.dart, for example, my class advice. I have two things to receive from the internet that I need. For example, ID, integer, it was string advice, and then created a constructor. This is like default way. So later you can create objects. Then I created now a factory of constructor to get the JSON data and convert them to what an object that I can, for example, show on the screen. At the end, I'm going to show, for example, I will write advice.id or advice.advice. It will give me the data that I got. So the factory advice dot, we call it from JSON. It will take a map of string and dynamic JSON. This is JSON data that you are going to get from the internet. This is the map of what JSON and string and dynamic. Okay. So after you get this data, for example, begin, final, advice equal, go inside the JSON. Now I'm saying find the slip. Where is the slip? This is the slip. So now we get to this is parsing. We start immediately go to the slip. Inside the slip, we have these two variables, ID and advice. So then we said, for example, return the advice object by using the constructor, this one. The ID, we said, get the ID from what? From where advice? The advice here is slip. Inside the slip, what we have? ID here, we have to write inside the square brackets, ID. And again, if we want to get now for the object also, we need the advice parameter DOM. So the advice will be what? The advice, which will be also, this is inside the JSON, the slip. Inside the slip, go and find what? For example, advice. So inside the slip, we have, for example, this is a slip. Inside the slip, we have advice. Advice will give you these data. Okay. So now we get these data from the JSON. We store them as return as an object. This object now that you are going, whenever you call from JSON, you give it the JSON data. So it will give you an object which has ID with advice from the internet, the data that you get. After that, now we have also to create function. Maybe it's better to do this way, to fetch the advice or data from the internet. Of course, this function should be async. It requires time. The type of return type will be future of what? Future of advice, because you want the data that we will get, we will convert to advice by using this function from JSON. It will give you back an advice. So future of advice, it means whenever you get the data, after that, convert this object to advice. The future is just temporary. Begin. Inside this fetch advice function, URL we put, for example, this URL that API query, okay, that I'm using here at the top, as you can see, to make what? To make more queries. Whenever I press now enter, just refresh, I get more advices. So this is the API request. I have to give it, or URL, let us call it here. We give it to the URL. Then response. The response will be what? Final response, data that you'll get after you make the request. So this will be the response, this one, okay? This one will be the response that you'll get after you make the query. So response here, we are going to create variable final response equals await, then get function. Get function, it's from the HTTP library. It needs from you a URI object. So, but we have only URL. So how to convert URL to URI? You have to write this code inside get function. Get function, as you can see, it's accepting what? URI. So URI.parse, it will take your link, this one, convert it to URI for you. So to be accepted by the get function. If you just use like this, it will tell you get function. I don't accept, for example, strings or URL, for example. I need from you URI. So how we can do so? By using URI.parse. It will convert URL or string to URI. Then after that, now we will check in the code. If response.status code 200. If the connection is correct, if there is data, begin. Create final. We create a variable called JSON response equal JSON.decode. JSON.decode will get the response. What is the response now? Response is from the server or from API is response.body. Response.status code, it will give you, for example, what? If it's 200, it means connection correct. 404, page not found, or there is something wrong, for example. So as long as 200 connection is correct, now we have to receive the data. This data will be a string. A response.body will give you a string. We have to convert to what? We have to convert to a JSON. For example, a map of string. So this, how to convert, for example, to your data to a JSON, JSON.decode. JSON.decode will get your data, convert to JSON, you stored here. Then this JSON data that we get, we can give it now to our function from JSON. From JSON will take this JSON data, give you back an object that you can maybe now this object you can show on the screen, or you can just do whatever you like. So return from JSON response. So we get the JSON response, we give it from JSON, it will give you back an object which has now the ID that you get with the advice. Every time you call this function, fetch advice, it will get the data and store it in advice object. It will be returned here as an advice. You can later show it here as we are showing on the screen. Return, for example, we create here an object, as you can see in the main. This is the object, advice. So now this advice that we created here has, for example, whenever we write the object name dot advice or dot ID, you will get what? You'll get it on the UI as a text. Okay. After we do this, after we created this one, otherwise, if something wrong, there is no internet, whatever, fail to fetch weather data or fail to fetch what? Advice data. Advice data. Okay. If something wrong, and if it is not 200, if for example 404. Now inside now after we get the data, we have everything ready. It's time now working on the app. So we have a stateful widget, for example, because data keep changing. So Then inside, for example, this stateful widget here, we created advice. This empty object has nothing now. Later, I will create a function here. For example, I can call this function not get weather, should be get what? Refactor get advice. Refactor get advice. Okay, so get advice, it's async function, it requires time, it will return for you future or void, return nothing. Just will make, for example, a request to the API. Final, we create an object, for example, or variable called advice equals await for fetch advice. Inside, always, whenever we call this function we need later when the user click on the button, on this button. Okay, whenever user click on this advice me, so we have to do what? We'll call this function get advice. It will return nothing, just it will make the request and it will update this our variable, empty variable. It will take the data now. It'll fetch advice, as you know, this one fetch advice. It will take it will make a request and it will give you the object. Okay. After we get this object, we have to transfer this object that we get from fetch advice, stored in this advice. Then also, after we store, we have this new object. Now we have to transfer this data to our empty object. This one is empty, so we take the data that we get from the internet. In this advice, we store them here. Then we send them to where we store them inside. We replace it with the empty object that we have here. So now this object now is not empty anymore, as long as the user call this function. Inside now, material app, as you know, there is scaffold, application bar, all this. In the center, maybe here we have a column. This column has image.network to show this image. Then text button, which has maybe some background elevations and shadow and so on. After that, we have maybe some padding here. After padding, we have also a column. Inside this column, we have we can show maybe the advice, for example, what we call it, the ID and the advice itself. So inside this, now I can just make it smaller text. Let me just make it, for example, here. I will repeat it 2 times. I will show, for example, if it is not null, also show ID. Okay, the object cannot be assigned to a parameter of type string. So in this case, advice, if we just check it out, dot, we have the ID, right? Fill advice not null. If it is not null, show advice.id. And if it is null, cannot. So the argument type object cannot be assigned to parameter of type string. So something wrong now is going to be stored in the null. We check it out. It is not null, okay. Otherwise, something wrong will be shown on the text. So advice ID. I guess here is expecting to dot to string. Just to solve the issue, as long as it's asking for to convert this integer to string, I just make it in that way. Anyway, so now, okay, if we just run, now we are getting these IDs every time. We're getting different ID with different advice. So we are saying here, if the advice is not null, just show what? Advice object that we have it here. Okay, the advice object, just go inside the advice object, and as you know, the advice object has what? Has 2 parameters. Has always the ID with the advice itself. So if it is not null, show the advice, or if it is null, as you know, ternary operator to say something wrong. Then this is just a style for that text. Again, also, if it is not null, show the ID and convert to string to be accepted, because this text only accepting, as you know, string doesn't accept integer. So otherwise it shows something wrong and so on. In the beginning, of course, when you run this application, maybe you'll get something wrong. Why? Because in the beginning, before you make the request, it was empty object, the advice.id, advice. Both of them were what? Empty. Whenever you make advice me, now it will go and get the data and store this data in the new on the new object. It will be replaced with the new data. I guess this explanation was clear for this example, but maybe a little bit. You need you need more to see other examples. For example, working with arrays. I guess all of you applied this one with one of your groups, working with arrays. So in that case, maybe you have, because just you have to change your code a little bit. For example, here inside this JSON, from JSON, just you have to make a few changes to be able to work. So maybe at that time, for example, if you have, let us say inside the ID, let us say if there was another array, we have to go now and write, for example, index, if it was array, index 0. So it will go inside, if there is inside the ID, there's an array called index 0, it will go and get the data, put them there. If there is, for example, index 0, inside index 0, there was some other attribute, for example, called, for example, I don't know, anything, for example, anything. So this is anything now. You will go inside the ID, inside index 0, anything, you'll get it stored where in the ID. If you have arrays, I mean, if you have here arrays in this code, for example, here inside the ID, if we have square brackets, inside these square brackets, maybe you have something. At that time, you have to work, for example, on that. If you have, for example, inside this one, instead of 52, if we have an array, and this array, for example, have something, maybe it has an age object, first object, then comma, maybe another object. So inside this first object, maybe could be maybe some strings, for example, anything. This anything, for example, has colon, also a value, which is maybe anytime, and so on. So to get, for example, to this anytime, in that case, you have to go where you have to go and to do that JSON parsing in this way. Okay, so inside the ID, let's say we have something called anything, and we have to, now we have inside this ID, it is a JSON array. Inside this JSON array, we have what? We have first object and second object. If I want first object, I will just go index 0. If I write anything, I will get now anytime. So to access to this point, now I have to do what? I have to, for example, go inside the slip, then inside the ID, then inside index 0, because this is array using square brackets. Then I will get this one, anything, anytime. Okay, if you need second one, you can, for example, here, you can, if you have also anything, you can go to index 1, index 0, this is index 1, okay? I guess that's it. Now, this is how to do JSON parsing in a clear way for you. From JSON will be just manipulated or updated حسب the data that you'll get from the server until you reach the data. You have to store them in the variable. After that, everything will go, I think, smoothly or run smoothly in your code. Hopefully, it was clear for you. Wish you the best in your project.